Overnight, and this is just as a way of introducing Craig this morning, the Scottish Government has ditched, you'll be fascinated to know, the most woke government and a professed world leader in climate change policy. The Scottish Government has ditched its flagship target of reducing greenhouse gas emissions by 75% by 2030. And although they've got that later target of going to net zero by 2045, the reality is that they've missed 8 of their 12 annual targets, the Scots, and they've been told that reaching the 75% milestone by the end of the decade is unachievable. This coming from their version of the Climate Change Commission, which is called the Climate Change Committee, how original, which provides independent advice to Scottish ministers. So even the Scots are failing to, in actual fact, reach up to their, and they've embraced this in pretty much the same way as New Zealand has embraced nuclear-free policy. So the Scottish National Party have seen climate change policy and its responses to that very much as part of being a modern Scot. Well, it's a bit like there are some football teams, isn't it? Rugby and football. Lots of promise, not much performance. Joining us to talk, though, about various issues to do with the economy and including environment and climate change policies is, as usual, Craig Stobo. Craig, welcome to the show. Good afternoon to you.
Thank you.
With Michael Laws and Craig Stobo. Brought to you by Negotiate NZ, making serious discussions easier. Visit negotiate.nz or phone 0800 Discuss It, 0800 347 2877.
There you are. You've got your own introduction. You've got your own sponsor, Craig.
Well,
isn't that amazing?
Thank you. I must meet the sponsor at some point and thank them for looking after you guys.
Well, there you go. Yeah. No, and they wanted to. I can't believe they actually chose you.
Yeah, well, I'd better behave myself today because I've got quite a bit to say.
Yeah, good on you.
Just on the Scots, don't forget the Scottish Enlightenment that was ushered in the late 1700s, 1800s, which led to, amongst other things, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations. So don't knock the Scots too much. They have a history of great thinking, and that's what I want to talk about today. I'm a bit wary of experts, in case you didn't know, Michael, experts who use their position to prevent debate, or people who unthinkingly use experts as a source of truth and cancel independent thinking. So hopefully today you'll get a flavour of my thinking on climate change, which will be of interest to your audience. So I'm just going to run through some kind of logical thinking, if you don't mind, and we'll get to the Climate Change Commission report at the end. But we'll just sort of start with the science and try and get everyone on the same page. So if you just bear with me, at any point you just stop me if you don't understand what I'm saying. So very, very briefly on the science, based just on the physics of energy, carbon dioxide absorbs and emits, a doubling of CO2 concentration from pre-industrial levels would by itself cause a global average temperature change of about 1%. But, and this is really important for our debate, however, in the overall climate system, things are much more complex as warming leads to further feedback loops that affect or either amplify or diminish the initial warming. And that's all around water vapour, clouds and ocean water. And this is coming out of the Royal Society, the UK Academy. And what they then said was it is impossible to give precise estimates of how global or regional temperature trends will evolve decade by decade, because you cannot predict how much CO2 human activities will predict. You cannot get an understanding currently of the complexities of how climate feedback operates with a range of scenarios. And finally, over timescales of a decade or so, natural variability can modulate the effects of the underlying trend in temperature. So that's kind of the science. The issue is the impact of water and all the other things that make it really hard to predict the future. Despite that, the scientific community, through the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, tries to model long-term scenarios over 100 years. Now, I'm a sceptic on the utility of these models. They do their very best, but you cannot capture system-wide economic, social, cultural futures in a model. And the best example of my scepticism was the Club of Rome, which you might recall published the book Limits to Growth in 1972, using computer simulations to suggest that economic growth could not continue indefinitely because of resource depletion. And that report was pretty quickly rubbished by the OECD. Although the book was very popular, it still doesn't hold sway today. So then we come to the reports that the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has produced. And the fifth report in 2014 has a summary and quite clearly says, the evidence for human influence on the climate system has grown since the last report in 2007. It is extremely likely that more than half of the observed increase in global average surface temperatures from 1951 to 2010 was caused by human influence increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the flip side of that statement is there is some likelihood that up to 50% of warming was not caused by humans. So we have a debate around how much of CO2 increase is caused by humans, as evidenced by the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Nevertheless, they try and punch out some scenarios, and at the optimistic end, they've got strong mitigation by governments and peoples and societies that only leads to 2% warming, or a disaster scenario where there's no mitigation and we get to 2.6 to 4.8% global warming over 100 years. Right? That's a long, long, long time frame. You then roll forward to the next assessment report in 2023, and there's more information coming to scientists. And so they've changed their narrative. They're changing their story a little bit. And that's important when we get to the Climate Change Commission report. The uncertainty range on assessed future changes in global surface temperature is narrower than the last report. For the first time in an IPCC assessment cycle, projections of global surface temperatures, ocean warming and sea level rise are constrained using observations and the assessed climate sensitivity. The likely range has meant that it is narrowed to 2.5 degrees to 4 degrees with an average of about 3, based on multiple lines of evidence, including improved understanding of cloud feedback. So we're learning more about the feedback systems, and the extremes of concerns in the last 20 years have been moderated. So we're looking at more evidence to come, I think, on climate modelling. Then we get to the New Zealand Climate Change Commission. They are also...
Okay, so sorry, Craig, just before you get there, so if I could summarise what you're saying is, every year, these scientists or the people responsible for this policy output look at further evidence that is available to them, some they have never assessed before, and they continually moderate they moderate their reports and their advice going forward. So it's an evolving beast. Yeah?
Correct.
Right.
And
cool.
And it's modelling, which is a mathematical way of capturing system-wide data to try and get an outcome based on a whole lot of assumptions.
Yeah.
And those assumptions are based on the best science at the time, but we know from what the Royal Society just said that water is a really important mechanism in determining CO2 concentrations. And that science, I believe, is not well developed. And that's why you've had that iteration of improvement in the last report in 2023 from IPCC. Now we turn to the New Zealand Climate Change Commission, which has pushed out a budget for 2036-2040, which they're required to do under the Act. And the question is, what should be the maximum quantity of emissions for New Zealand for that 5-year period? Bear in mind how far that away is. That's over 10 years away. But they're suggesting, based on their models, a certain number of megatons of CO2, 134, and no offshore carbon credits. So they use economy-wide models too to understand the impacts of different systems' impact on climate change, tested and validated by international experts, which, going to my opening comment, who are they and how can we challenge them? But they're now having to revise earlier budgets in New Zealand because they underestimated how many more forests were planted. They didn't know that Marsden Point was going to close, and they're suggesting that we're going to have technology changes going out to 2036, including vaccines for sheep. So it's really hard being a modeller when you've put some assumptions in, and then you find the society that you're operating on or trying to assess is changing, right?
Yeah.
So you've got to be really, really careful.
Yep.
So You then get to page 44 of the Climate Change Commission report, which is an important piece of work to understand why they have the conclusions that they do. And this is the quote. While New Zealand has a split gas approach, the Act requires the Commission to recommend budgets that are a total quantity of emissions for all GHGs. And bear in mind in New Zealand, just about half of our GHGs are methane. And they've got those emissions in the methodology for all GHGs in terms of the equivalent value of CO2. So our recommendation, this is the Climate Change Commission, that we use the global warming potential, which is those models in the IPCC numbers, that ensures consistency with methods used by every other party to the Climate Change Paris Agreement group. So that means at present, this New Zealand Climate Change Commission must apply the IPCC's assessment report number 5, which is 2014. And they don't use the 2023 report, which is updated for better information on, for example, cloud feedback. So we've got an out-of-date set of assumptions in our New Zealand Climate Change Commission report. Secondly, and this is really important because it goes to our particular emissions, methodology for modelling those CO2 outputs and concentrations uses this global warming potential 100 methodology. That means in the 2021 report put out by the IPCC called the Physical Science Basis, using methane emissions as CO2 equivalent emissions using GWP 100 methodology overstates the effect of methane emissions on global surface temperatures by a factor of 3 to 4 times. This is coming from the scientists in the UN, IPCC, and it's not in our document here in New Zealand, when obviously we're unusual in climate change terms because our methane is such a large contributor.
Yeah.
So we're overstating the problem.
Mm-hmm.
Why are we not disclosing our reliance on an old 2014 report? And why are we not advising the Crown, the government, the public that actually our numbers may be overstated? This is really important.
Oh, agreed.